Ladies and gentlemen, it's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. And my name is Sasha Star, and my today's guest is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Yeah, great to have you. And I was searching in the last few days for a documentary which was produced actually in Canada by Russian. Movie director Trofimova, I think her name, and there was a big uproar in Toronto, which actually the movie could not be shown because the movie is about Russian soldiers. It had a grant from Canadian government, and apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but what I understand about the movies that they show the lives of Russian soldiers and how they're suffering in this war and so on and on. Okay, I will tell you more about this movie after I will see it, of course, because I remember in Soviet times there was, for example, when Solzhenitsyn's book Archipelago went out, and
Yeah.
they had discussions about this book. So many people would say, I haven't read that book, but I despise it, or I hate it, or I denounce it, or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I despise it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't want to be in that position. However, while searching for that movie, I found another documentary movie produced by in England by the name. This movie, its name Russians at War, but one the British movie documentary as well is Russia at War. That's a very subtle difference between the names of these movies. And I saw the British documentary, and it's done after 1 year after the beginning of invasion, and they have a crew, British crew. Probably some of them probably spoke Russian, but most of them not. So they were interviewing average people and average towns, small towns like Samara or Saratov or some really undistinguished towns in Russia. And what they discovered is that people honestly believe, and some of these people they have a higher education, they have well-paid jobs, and they honestly believe that it's a NATO that started invasions. They used Ukrainians because they didn't want to do it themselves, so they used Ukrainians, and Ukrainians now are trying to defeat Russia. And NATO, of course, helps Ukraine any way they could. And it's up to Russian people to get united and fight off the aggressors and probably win this war at the end of the day. And there were so many similar interviews like this one. And I was thinking, Jesus, it reminds me of what really happened in Germany in the 30s, where German people, also highly educated and historically a very advanced nation, they were completely brainwashed by Hitler's propaganda. So that almost goes in parallel of what's happening today in Russia. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I tend to agree with you for the most part. It is a very, from the Russian perspective, Russian leadership's perspective, it's a very successful indoctrination program, which gets them to believe or support almost anything. And it would take a tremendous shock. I mean, a tremendous shock, a decisive operational defeat in Ukraine, when they're actually in Ukraine and they're being defeated, it would to actually reverse that narrative. It would take some really shocking events, and which illustrates the challenge that Ukraine is up against. And so now it is again, as I've contended earlier, it is now a question of the destiny of Ukraine is still squarely in its own hands. They have to find a way to inflict a decisive enough operational defeat on Russian forces, whether it's inside of Russia itself or whether they find a way to, or an opportunity to seal off the Crimea, isolate it, and force its to surrender back into Ukrainian control. They need some sort of surprise operational defeat in order to reverse the political tide and force Russia to basically agree to an armistice, and an armistice in which they withdraw from Ukraine. It's like the leader of Finland said: "What is it going to take for ending the war is easy. Easy. You know, Russia simply withdraws from Ukraine. That ends the war." So nothing short of that.
Uh, you know, Shankar, what's interesting is that in possibility of Trump winning presidency, and either assist efforts to bring Ukraine and Russia to negotiations, or maybe simply make a decision that helping Ukraine really does not advance interests of American people, and therefore it has to be stopped right there, right now. And as he said many times before, that no even a single penny of help to Ukraine. I don't know if he really meant it. Maybe he
I
didn't.
don't think he does.
Hitler.
I'll tell you right. I'll tell you right now. He is uh, having observed President Trump's actions over the past 4 years or so, and including during his previous administration. Do not assume that you know what. Do not assume that you know what Trump is going to do when the actual moment comes, because I would keep in mind Trump is able to show a unique ability to compel. Others didn't know quite how to deal with him, and he used that uncertainty and unpredictability to his advantage. You will notice that during his administration, Russia did not dare invade Ukraine. And it's saying, well, where did Russia undertake aggression against Ukraine? During the 2014, when Obama was the president, and during the Biden administration, when Biden's the president. But he's not invading during a Republican administration. So if Mr. Trump should win in November, do not assume that he is automatically going to throw Ukraine to the wolves. And because he has shown that he is capable of doing just about anything if he catches his opponents off guard. So I would withhold judgment on the consequences of whoever wins in November. I note that the Russian newspapers are actually surprised or marveling at the possibility that Kamala Harris could be president, and they're doing so for surprise. There seems to be some racial motivations, because Russians are not exactly unbiased when it comes to race. They have shown that they can be every bit as racist and misogynistic, well, whatever other pejorative you want to use, as any other nation. So they are not exactly prejudice free. So I would be again, Mr. Trump's President Trump's unpredictability and ability to make his opponents feel more uncertain of what to do and or how President Trump might react in a given situation is actually to President Trump's advantage. And that is something that should be taken into account in calculating what the effect of a second Trump administration would be on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict.
Yeah, Jonathan, I agree with you on that. And well, it just all remains to be seen what's happened in election and post-election. However, what Ukrainians are doing now, they are looking at possible, not desirable, but very possible scenario that, well, it's not even granted that Kamala Harris will continue its help to Ukraine. It's possible, but it's not certain, I would say, at least this. So they're learning now to live fairly soon as a possibility in a new world where there will be no more help, at least from the United States. There could be continued help from European nations, and in fact, that help is increasing from almost every European Union country, whether it's the Baltic states, Poland, and many other countries. So, what Ukraine needs, with or without US help, is a increasing production of their own weapons. That's what they really need, because the help is help, but whether it will be there in 6 months or 12 months or 8 months,
They
they
need to produce a lot of Polanitsa.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. They need Palenitsa. They are producing actually fantastic capacity drones that can hit now targets of well over 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine border. And now I've heard from very trusted sources that while there is a decision about allowing Ukraine use long-range missiles on Russian territory or not, or maybe some targets maybe yes and some other targets no. In the meantime, very quietly, U.S. prepared, I think it's 1.5 million high quality drones that can fly up to 1,500 kilometers and which are very precise and have fairly good warheads to be exploded. So a lot of things are happening on a front that all journalists are following, and websites and so on. And there are some other things that are happening, but they're not being heavily publicized. But that's the case. Now, also recently, as we discussed already on our program, but it's the fact that both China and Iran, they're getting farther and farther away from Russia. They're not particularly um, enticed by Russia's talking about using nuclear arms. Now they're talking about doing some explosion in their one of their polygons in Novaya Zemlya, I think, and well,
Novaya Zemlya, that I believe was where they once tested that 58 megaton blast.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
Novaya Zemlya is considered uninhabitable, large parts of it, for the next several centuries because of that detonation. So, yeah, that's not terribly surprising.
Well, they would use it probably in air, not right on the Novaya Zemlya. Same as the Tsar bombs. It was blown in. Uh, what is it? It was about 5 or even 10 kilometers away from the ground, but the effect was absolutely incredible. And it was only 50 kilotons because megatons, because Russians were talking about using 100. But then their scientists say that that could destroy actually the Earth in some scenarios. Depends on the weather and so other factors. So it's better stick to 50. And the 50 was quite awesome. And
Definitely ruins anybody's day.
but you know what? I'm not so sure if today Russia could do this type of detonations as
That is an open that you're right. That is an open question because apparently the Russians do not devote as nearly as much to maintenance of their nuclear weapons as does the West, particularly the U.S. We make sure that all of our nuclear weapons work. Yeah,
absolutely.
we have a certain number, and that is a far more effective deterrent than than building a nuclear arsenal, which on paper looks like it's more numerically superior, but its actual quality and reliability is suspect.
Now, there was an interesting article in, I think it's Foreign Affairs, where there was a European analysis that the war between European NATO countries and Russia is unavoidable, and the longest it will take 7 years. But it will happen earlier than 7 years, and they urge to produce enough weapons and get ready for a war. It's unavoidable. Well, I would agree with this, unless there is one scenario where Putin will be pushed out of power, or somehow Russia will disintegrate in a few smaller countries, 7, 8, 15 maybe, and 15 is a number of republics.
Or alternately, an out of the box scenario would be but we managed to convince the next administration, presidential administration, whichever one that is, to cooperate with NATO in building what we have discussed called the Worldwide Strategic Defense Matrix, WISDOM. That would require, by the way, a massive paradigm shift in American strategic thinking, going from mutually assured destruction, MAD, to Worldwide Strategic Defense Matrix, WISDOM. That is a paradigm shift which would be both symbolic and real. And it would require a massive diversion of resources from the Pentagon's budget to construction of more ballistic missile defenses to create that ring of interlocking shields around the arsenals of our adversaries, as well as create the U.S. equivalent of an Iron Dome defense. But as we have discussed, in order to have the same effect as an Iron Dome defense, the U.S. would have to upgrade its Space Force to include a space fleet armed with laser weapons capable of shooting down nuclear missiles in their boost phase. The thing is, just like in World War I, all of the individual technological advancements in World War I that had the potential to change the nature of warfare on the Western Front, they were all there, but by themselves, unintegrated, they had limited effectiveness on the fighting on the Western Front. And it took the Germans after World War I to integrate all of these new developments into a coherent doctrine, which eventually became known as Blitzkrieg doctrine. In the same way, we now have, at this point in our history, the individual technological components for neutralizing nuclear weapons on a worldwide basis. They all exist. What remains to be done is the political will and the actual redirection of resources in a new doctrine, which would create the Worldwide Strategic Defense Matrix. And the thing is, it is possible. It is just not being active. As far as we know, it is not being actively thought of or contemplated. So, I contend that the potential is very real, and it is there, and it is as I've stated before, the one thing that the Russian political and military leadership fear more than anything else is the potential of American technology to neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power, its nuclear missile arsenal. So that is the thing that no one discusses except you and me, and that the potential is there. But what remains to be is the actual will and the decision to do so. And that is, and by the way, that strategic defense matrix would easily be extended over Ukraine and protect it from any further missile attacks by Russia. So there is potential here. But right now, as matters stand right now, the Ukrainians do have their own cards to play. And if you'll notice, by the way, in the past week, those attacks that we assume that the Israelis pulled off by detonating several thousand pagers, first one day on Tuesday, detonating several thousand pagers of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then following that up the next day with detonating a whole bunch of radio walkie-talkies, detonating them all and causing casualties. That sends a very powerful message to Hezbollah. It tells them, you are not safe anywhere. None of you are. We will find you. And so just as Israel is taking matters into its own hands to ensure their security, so too Ukraine may take a cue from Israel and say, okay, we have to do this ourselves. We can't count on a certain or continued U.S. help or even increased European help. We need to convince them by inflicting a decisive defeat on Russia somewhere that backing us is worth it and is the wiser course.
I've heard the analysis of one of the war correspondents, and they analyzed what Ukrainians are doing so well and not so well against Russians in its war, and what they should do more than anything else. What they see is strategically, Russia is still superior force to Ukrainians. But tactically, Ukrainians so much better because even the um, actions that they have now in the Kursk region, where Russia now is accumulating quite powerful force, but they're helpless because they're attacking like it was in during Second War or even First World War. And Ukrainians, they are with a small but very capable units. They're attacking Russians in several different directions, almost at the same time. And Russians, they can figure out what to expect and where the next Ukrainian attack is coming from. And they're not doing a lot of progress. Their attacks and the movements near Pokrovsk are being stopped temporarily. They cannot make any progress. And if I don't know if you can call the progress that they're making 1 kilometer ahead during the last several months. And Ukrainians done so much better in the Kursk region in a matter of few weeks than Russia done in several months. And that's where they.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have the Russians off balance tactically and to a certain extent operationally, given the reverses that Russia has suffered with its Black Sea fleet, given the fact that the fact that their logistical connection to the Crimea is very tenuous and could be cut off completely at any time, and again, the fact that the Russians have gone through their best quality forces. They don't have superior quality forces waiting on the sidelines, waiting to come on off the bench and say, okay, now it's time to bring in our good stuff. No, that's not going to work. So now it has now become very much a political battle with Ukraine trying to find a way to inflict a decisive enough defeat that will convince the Allies to stick and the U.S. to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes, and then to force Russia to its breaking point, where they said, "Okay, we've had enough of this. We need to pull back and look for a better opportunity in the future." So this is still very much an open conflict. It is still very much within Ukraine's ability to control its own destiny, but the weather is not going to cooperate. Well, we have maybe another in the Ukraine on the Eastern Front. What we have maybe another month or so.
Yeah, maximum.
Another month maximum of decent weather, whereby Ukraine could undertake an offensive, and so the window is closing, but it does not mean that Ukraine will not be able to pull it off. They are continuing to keep their own counsel, very much so, and very wisely so. And so it has to be we're watching and waiting and looking for subtle indicators that Ukraine is acquiring the qualitative means as well as the numerical means to undertake that surprise offensive counterstroke.
By the way, I've heard the analysis that Zelensky, quite a while ago, even probably 3-4 months ago, he announced that they created 14 new brigades ready to go, but they didn't have enough ammunition for this brigade. So they're kind of exist ready to go, but supposedly not enough ammunition. So the question was, a couple of days ago, was put, so where are these brigades? Even if they don't have enough ammunition, but they must exist somewhere. So they came to the conclusion that these are brigades that already have enough weapons and ammunition, and they are ready to go, whether it will be Crimea direction or maybe some other direction, but they are ready, they're in reserve. Right. and
so yes, then and Sasha, that's a very key indicator there. These 14 brigades that, they say, oh well, they don't have enough ammunition. Well, obviously they're going to accumulate and try to set aside enough ammunition for these brigades to be made operational and to be used. And I suspect if they were to be used, they would not simply be fed into the defensive lines of the East. They would be used in an offensive counterstroke. against the Crimea. Yeah, like I said, let's use the analogy of the Second World War, as the Allies were closing in on Nazi Germany from the west, and they had to pause in the Ardennes and along that close to the Rhine, and they had to pause because they had to wait for their logistics to catch up. But at the same time, Nazi Germany had created the equivalent of 2 panzer armies within Germany. That was their strategic reserve, and they had to decide against whom to counter it. Now, Hitler thought that, committing against the West, driving to Antwerp, and cutting off the Western Allies and force the Allies to some sort of settlement in the West was the way to go. The strategic alternative, as you realize, and as we've discussed, would have been to throw and I actually discussed this with a retired German field marshal years ago. The alternative would have been to throw those panzer armies in the east against the Soviets, to drive through to the Kurland Peninsula, where the German 19th Army had been cut off. They'd been cut off on that little peninsula. They were sustaining themselves barely by sea supply through the Baltic. But if the German Panzer armies had been used to cut against the Soviets, to forge a corridor through to the Courland Peninsula, enable the 19th Army to get out of there and pull back and rejoin the remainder of the German army in the east, to reconstitute and form a more solid defensive line in the east to hold off the Soviet army, and essentially enable the Germans to surrender to the Western Allies. Because who do you want to surrender to? The Americans, the British, the French, or the Russians? Well, anybody with common sense in the German army at that time, that we preferred to surrender to anybody but the Russians. Because they knew what was awaiting them. And so those are strategic alternatives. So extrapolating that to the present situation, okay, Ukraine, according to Zelensky, has created this reserve of 14 brigades. How are they going to use them? Well, a very unimaginative and unproductive way to use them would be simply to feed them into and reinforce the front lines to halt the Russians, or you could, by husbanding your resources and your logistics, get them to those 14 brigades to a sufficient state where they could be used in a counteroffensive against an isolated Crimea. And that's the key. But once the Crimea is logistically isolated from reinforcement, then those 14 brigades could, in theory, be used in a counteroffensive to force those Russian occupation forces in Crimea to surrender. So, again, the Ukrainians are not giving any clue about their intentions in that regard, but the mere fact that they have a strategic reserve, the fair fact that they have, they say that just lacks ammunition and sufficient supply. This cannot be discounted, and I would advise not discounting the possibility of an October surprise on the part of the Ukrainians, where they conduct a surprise counteroffensive. They have the Russians off balance. They have them overextended. They're inflicting superior casualties. They still have tactical superiority over the Russians, and that superiority will no doubt increase as the Ukrainians get more F-16s operational, and they could very well establish local air superiority over the Crimea.
And not only Crimea, maybe elsewhere. Jonathan, I want to ask you about one thing. If there wouldn't be constant bombardments of Ukrainian cities by Russians, essentially Ukraine, the way they conduct the war, they can fight Russians indefinitely. And essentially, I think they can win the conventional war against Russia if there wouldn't be bombardment of Ukrainian cities and a great number of civilians being killed. So why wouldn't NATO and US would ask Russians that they will withhold for a time being the permission to shoot Russian targets in Russian territory in exchange for Russia to stop the bombardments of Ukrainian cities and civilian targets. Do you think it could be something to offer?
Well, conversely, they could offering the Russians a concession or offering them something like that I contend, would still be perceived by the Russians as weakness.
I know.
But what you have to do is you have to threaten to nullify one of their capabilities, in line with their constant bombardment of by the Russians of Ukrainian cities with missile attacks and whatever. Conversely, let's say for the sake of argument that President Trump becomes president in November, and what he could do is he could threaten to reinforce greatly reinforce Ukraine's defensive capabilities against missile attack. That would be the preliminary step towards creating the wisdom system. And so you could, by threatening to nullify Russia's ability to engage in missile attack, that would be a credible deterrent, in the Russian perception, again, because they fear the potential as well as the actual ability of American technology to nullify their advantages, and most of all, potentially nullify their nuclear arsenal. So the U.S. has options, and more options than one would think. In this sense, it is not to be discounted. Although a lot of people in the Western press are saying, "Oh, if Trump becomes president, he's going to throw the Ukrainians to the wolves," and overlooking the fact that President Trump's unpredictability and willingness to engage in unilateral action actually works in his favor. So it's a very interesting situation to watch. But again, if I were a gambling man I'd be putting my money on the Ukrainians actually executing another surprise counteroffensive stroke now I would say in October.
Yeah, and maybe even late September. It's still not too late.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, if the Israelis can be unpredictable, so can the Ukrainians.
I think in case of Israel, I think that the Hamas and Hezbollah, I think they don't study the history, how Israel is dealing with their enemies. Number one, of course, it's Munich 72, when their onslaught, and I think it was 11 Israeli athletes were killed in Munich. And within a few years, no one who participated in these atrocities, no one was alive any longer. All of them were killed. It doesn't matter, they were hiding, some in Vienna and some in Amsterdam and some other countries. And here, all of them were killed, 100%. No one survived. So now, obviously, what's happened almost a year ago now, on October 7th, all the planners of that attack, all the perpetrators, all the people who were in charge of that attack, nobody will be alive. They just don't understand this. This is the Israeli Mossad policy, to punish and kill, actually kill, not to bring to justice or so on, but to kill everyone participating in that. I'm surprised.
They're applying what Stonewall Jackson advocated after one particular battle. I believe it was Fredericksburg, and the Confederates soldiers asked Jackson, "What are we going to do about this, General?" And Jackson's reply was, "Kill them all."
Well, it's, as we discussed several times in our program, the killing of enemy's troops is the main and the most important aim of any war, any government action which has been attacked, and so on. It's a killing enemy, the soldiers, generals, it doesn't matter who they are. So I think that Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, some of them are living in Qatar, having $1 billion fortunes and so on. Maybe they have to think about something.
They're all probably now looking nervously at their new cell phones. They can there say, is this one of those? I'm not sure. So yeah, then it's causing all of them to think twice about using any kind of communication
Yeah.
other than carrier pigeon.
Well, I think it was a very powerful message, and maybe Ukraine can learn something from that. Maybe Ukraine can do even more inventives, not to diminish what they're already doing, but getting even more creative. And
You can't discount the possibility that the Ukrainians and the Israelis are in are in, shall we say, undeclared communication with each other. And it says
oh,
that if you're sitting there and say, if your existence is at stake, you're going to be looking for any kind of help you can reasonably get.
absolutely, yeah, and I hope that is the case. And Jonathan, I wish you. Great weekend, and
Same
hopefully
to
we'll
you.
have even better things. We will have even better news to discuss on Tuesday, same place, same time. Thank you
Excellent.
very much, everybody. Glory to Ukraine. Bye bye.